Soviet conscription was a population harvest at any cost. Its brutality went far beyond what most people can imagine. First, you need to understand a basic point. In the early stage of the war, Soviet losses were extremely heavy. Within just a few months, entire units were wiped out by the German army. The manpower gap was like a bottomless pit. Under these conditions, conscription was no longer a normal operation. It became a nationwide harvest of people at any cost. The front line was like a huge meat grinder. It constantly needed fresh lives to fill the gaps. So, conscription work, from an organized state action, quickly turned into something that swept through every city, every village, every household. It became an almost endless harvest of people. The most direct expression of this brutality was the complete breaking of age limits. In theory, the legal rule was that men from 18 to 50 had the duty to serve. But in practice, this rule was handled very flexibly, or simply ignored. Many boys of 17, or even 16, just out of school and still seeing the world through textbooks, were directly registered by conscription officers. They usually received only a few weeks, sometimes just a few days of rushed training. Often, training was limited to learning how to shoot and recognize basic commands, before being loaded onto trains and sent directly to places like Stalingrad or Kursk. Real hell on earth. These young lives, in brutal trench and street fighting, often survived only a few days on average. On the other hand, the upper age limit was also broken. Men in their 40s and 50s, even grandfathers, were widely conscripted. They were not always sent into frontline assault units. They were assigned to secondary defense tasks and dangerous logistics, transport, and rescue work, which also carried huge risks. German fire and air raids did not distinguish between front and rear. This extreme pressure on manpower penetrated every part of society, leaving almost no space untouched. Male technical workers and skilled craftsmen in factories were taken away in large numbers. They were replaced by women, the elderly, and teenagers. They worked 12 to 14 hours every day just to produce tanks, shells, and uniforms urgently needed at the front. The situation in rural areas was even worse. Able-bodied men were almost completely taken away. But grain quotas were not reduced at all. Women, children, and the elderly were left hungry, working the land with the most primitive methods to ensure grain supply for the army. If this was already the limit, then the existence of penal battalions and blocking detachments pushed this brutality into an institutionalized and chilling level. Under the famous Order 227, not a step back, any soldier who showed hesitation or retreat, or was judged unreliable by political officers, such as those who had been surrounded and later escaped, or those who returned from German POW camps after great hardship, could be sent directly into penal units without any formal trial. The task of penal battalions was to carry out the most dangerous, extremely low survival suicide-like missions. For example, crossing minefields with their bodies, or taking the first wave of German fire in frontal assaults. The weakest were assigned the bloodiest reconnaissance tasks. Their value was to use their lives to consume German ammunition and locate enemy firing positions, so that regular troops could attack later. In theory, if they survived several such missions, they might be restored to regular soldier status. But in reality, very few lived long enough for that. Alongside penal units were blocking detachments. They were deployed behind attacking troops, or stationed at key roads and bridges in the rear. Their core task was to stop any unauthorized retreat. They were authorized to shoot on sight any soldier they considered a deserter, even those who left their positions simply out of fear. This practice was widely and strictly enforced in the early stage of the war,
especially when the Soviet army was in retreat and morale was very low.
This created a very desperate atmosphere among frontline soldiers. Advancing meant dying under German fire. Retreating meant dying at the hands of their own sides guns. Although this practice became less frequent later in the war, especially during the counteroffensive stage, it remained deeply imprinted in every soldier's memory. It reflects the extreme measures the Soviet leadership was willing to take to maintain front stability. In addition, discriminatory treatment of different ethnic groups in conscription revealed another dimension of brutality. In the early stage of the war, due to general suspicion of loyalty, ethnic minorities inside the Soviet Union, such as Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and Volga Germans, were collectively punished and forcibly deported to Central Asia and Siberia. Among the deported population, men were deprived of the right to serve in the army at a time when manpower was most needed. Many struggled to survive in extremely harsh labor camps until the second half of 1942. when manpower shortages became critical, and the Soviet authorities began recruiting soldiers from these deported groups, forming special ethnic units that were often sent into the most dangerous and high casualty combat zones. This mixture of pragmatic needs and political distrust created a tragic structure. Severe shortages in logistics and equipment further intensified this brutality, especially in the first 1 or 2 years of the war, when conditions were at their worst. New soldiers were often sent to the front with incomplete equipment. A widely circulated claim said that 2 men shared 1 rifle. The one without a rifle would wait until his comrade fell, and then pick up the weapon and continue fighting. This may be exaggerated, but shortages of ammunition, winter clothing, and food were indeed the norm. Many recruits had almost no proper training. They only learned how to operate a bolt and use a bayonet before being rushed into trains and sent into the bloodiest battlefield of that era. Their lives were reduced in wartime arithmetic to pure numbers, a resource to be consumed in order to wear down the enemy and buy time. In short, Soviet wartime mobilization was a systematic, all-round, deeply rooted brutal operation. It was built on its huge population base, by stretching conscription to biological limits, completely replacing labor sectors by gender and age, enforcing strict battlefield discipline and punitive units, treating different ethnic groups differently, and showing extreme disregard for individual human life. It held the almost fatal blow in the early stage of the war, and eventually produced a massive army capable of strategic counteroffensives. But behind the victory, there were countless crushed individual lives, an unimaginable sacrifice of an entire generation, and deep suffering. This weight is something no victory can fully hide.